My name is Alara Vance, and 30 minutes ago, I watched my husband try to erase me with a single glass of juice. He didn't know I saw the reflection in the polished silver of the ice bucket. He didn't know I'd spent the last 3 weeks cataloging every lie, every late-night conference call, and every scent of expensive, cloying perfume that clung to his skin like a second, filthier layer. He thought he was the architect of a clean exit, a way to inherit the Vance estate without the mess of a divorce. But as I sat across from him at our 10-foot mahogany dining table, watching the woman he'd invited to talk business turn a ghostly shade of blue, I realized that some foundations are built on rot, and when rot meets a storm, the house doesn't just fall, it swallows everyone inside. Before we dive into how the juice he spiked for me ended up stopping the heart of his secret lover, I need you to do something. If you've ever felt the person you loved most becoming a stranger right before your eyes, drop a warning in the comments. And if you believe that what goes around comes around in the most poetic of ways, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to stay until the very end of this dinner party, because the dessert I served Kalen isn't something he'll ever be able to digest. To understand the vial in the juice, you have to understand the man holding the blank teen glass. Kalen Vance was the kind of man people described as unflappable. He was the CEO of Vance Logistics, a company my grandfather started in a dusty garage in 1952, and that I had spent my entire adulthood expanding. Kalen was handsome in that sharp, aggressive way that looks good on the cover of a business magazine but feels like ice when it's turned on you in a dark room. We had been married for 7 years, and for 6 of them, I believed I was the papasley, luckiest woman in the city. I was the brains. He was the face, and together we were untouchable. Or so I thought. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. It started with his phone. Kalen had always been private, but by the 7th year, his phone became an extension of his soul that I wasn't allowed to touch. If I even glanced at it while it sat on the nightstand, his entire posture would stiffen. He started coming home at 3 in the morning, smelling of cedarwood and a floral scent that was definitely not mine. When I asked him where he'd been, he'd just look at me with those cold, gray eyes and say, "Alara, the Albuquerque expansion is bleeding us dry. I'm trying to save your grandfather's legacy while you worry about the clock. Don't be small-minded." He used my grandfather's name like a shield, knowing it was the one thing I would never argue with. He played on my insecurities, calling me sensitive or overworked whenever I pointed out a discrepancy in his stories. But I wasn't sensitive. I was a Vance. And if there's one thing a Vance knows how to do, it's Odi. 3 weeks ago, I found the first real crack. I was looking for a misplaced tax document in Kalen's home office, a room I rarely entered because he kept it locked like a vault. But he'd left the key in his blazer pocket that morning, a rare slip-up that felt like an invitation. I wasn't looking for a mistress. I was looking for a receipt. Instead, I found a hidden compartment in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a secondary burner phone and a small, amber-colored glass vial with no label. My heart didn't just sink, it went cold. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I took a photo of the vial, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and called a friend from my university. Days who worked in toxicology. "Don't ask questions," I told him. "Just tell me. What's in this?" 2 days later, the report came back. It wasn't a recreational drug. It was a concentrated sedative, a potent neurotoxin that, in a high enough dose, could induce a cardiac event that looked entirely natural, especially in someone with a family history of heart issues. A history Kalen had been carefully reminding our family doctor about for months. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was preparing to end me. The betrayal was so vast I couldn't even feel the edges of it. It was a dark ocean, and I was drowning in the middle. But as I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, clutching that toxicology report, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. "If you're going to hunt a wolf, you have to let him. Think you're the sheep until his teeth are already at your throat." I went home and played the part. I was the doting, slightly tired wife. I complained of chest flutters and fatigue, feeding him the narrative I wanted. I watched him hide his smirk when I told him I'd made an appointment with a cardiologist. He even insisted on making me a health smoothie every time of you bruised morning, infused with vitamins. I poured every single one of those smoothies down the kitchen sink the moment his car left the driveway. Then came the dinner. The business meeting that would change everything. Kalen told me his lead consultant from the New York branch, a woman named Lyra Thorne, was coming over for a private dinner to finalize the merger. I'd seen Lyra's name in the logs. She was 24, a former model turned logistics expert who had no actual credentials other than the way she looked. In a pencil skirt. Kalen described her as a genius, but when I looked at the burner phone logs I'd managed to clone, the messages between them weren't about mergers. They were about the life they'd lead once I was out of the picture. She's a bit intense, Alara, Kalen had warned me as he straightened his tie in the mirror that evening. She's allergic to almost everything, so let's keep menu simple. Just the fresh apple juice from the orchard and the grilled sea. Base. No surprises. No surprises, I echoed, my voice as smooth as glass. I wouldn't want to ruin such an important night. I watched him in the kitchen through the crack in the door. He was preparing the kitchen the plosin. Drinks. We had a beautiful crystal pitcher of apple juice, the kind my grandfather used to make. Kalen reached into his pocket and pulled out the amber vial. I saw his hand shake not from guilt, I realized, but from the sheer, adrenaline-fueled excitement of what he was about to do. He dropped the liquid into one of the 3 glasses, the one with the slightly chipped base, my glass. He brought the tray into the dining room just as the doorbell rang. Lyra Thorne walked in looking like a predator in silk. She didn't even try to hide her disdain for me. She looked at our home, my grandfather's paintings, my antique furniture, like she was already deciding which pieces to throw out. It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman behind the man, Lyra said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She didn't look at me, she looked at Kalen. The look they exchanged was so intimate, so certain of my demise, that I almost felt a surge of pity for them. They were so confident, so incredibly arrogant. Let's sit, Kalen said, his voice tight. He placed the tray on the table. He positioned the chipped glass directly in front of my seat. He took his own, and the 3rd glass was set for Lyra. A toast, Kalen suggested, raising his glass. To the future. To new beginnings and the courage to take what you want. To the future, Lyra chirped, her eyes locked on Kalen. I reached for my glass. My fingers brushed the chipped base. Kalen's breath hitched. He was leaning forward, his pupils dilated. He wanted to see me take the first sip. He wanted to watch the light start to fade from my eyes before the main course was even served. But then, the doorbell rang again. Kalen jumped. Who could that be? We didn't invite anyone else. Oh, I forgot to mention, I said, standing up. I asked the neighbors to drop off those charity gala invites tonight. I'll just be a second. Lyra, dear, would you mind swapping seats with me? The draft from the window is a bit much for my delicate heart tonight. I didn't wait for an answer. I moved Lyra's plate and her glass to my spot, and I moved my chipped glass to her spot. It was a flurry of motion, a helpful wife adjusting the seating for a guest's comfort. Kalen was halfway to the Brechters' foyer, distracted by the unexpected guest, my lawyer, though he didn't know that. Yet, and by the time he turned back, the glasses had been moved. Lyra, ever the opportunist, had already sat down in the power seat I'd vacated. She reached for the glass in front of her. The glass with the chipped base. It really is a lovely juice, Kalen, Lyra said, raising it to her lips. Kalen walked back into the room, his face pale from the brief conversation at the door. He saw Lyra holding the glass. He saw me sitting in her old chair, smiling at him. He looked at the table. He looked at the glasses. I could see the gears turning in his head, the sudden, cold realization dawning that he couldn't remember which glass was which. He hadn't seen the swap. He only saw 2 identical liquids. Wait, Kalen blurted out, his hand reaching out. Lyra, don't. But she had already taken a long, deep swallow. Don't what, Kalen? She asked, laughing. Is it too expensive for the help? Kalen froze. He looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the sheep's mask slipping. I didn't look tired. I didn't look sensitive. I looked like a woman who knew exactly what was in that glass. Is something wrong, darling? I asked Kaylin. You look like you've seen a ghost. He couldn't speak. He was trapped. If he told Lyra to stop, he'd have to explain why the juice was dangerous. He'd have to admit to the spiking in front of me. He was gambling that he was wrong, that maybe he'd placed the glasses differently than he thought. He sat down, his movements jerky, and took a sip of his own safe drink. For the next 10 minutes, we ate in a silence so thick it was suffocating. I talked about the orchard. I talked about the history of the house. I watched Lyra. The first sign was the glass slipping from her hand. It didn't shatter. It just tipped over, the remaining juice staining the white linen tablecloth like a spreading bruise. Oh, Lyra whispered, her hand going to her throat. I feel a bit dizzy. Kylan, the heat. It's probably just the excitement, I said, leaning forward. Kaylin, help her. She looks quite unwell. Kaylin didn't move. He was paralyzed, watching the woman he loved, or at least the woman he'd chosen over me, start to succumb to his own design. Lyra tried to Fremsley stand, but her legs buckled. She slid out of the chair, her head hitting the edge of the table with a sickening thud before she crumpled onto the Persian. Whoa. Lyra! Kaylin finally screamed, finding his voice. He scrambled over to her, his face a mask of horror. Lyra, wake up! Alara, call 911. Do something. I didn't reach for my phone. I reached for my juice. I took a slow, deliberate sip from the safe glass and looked down at them. Why, Kaylin? I asked, my voice echoing in the silent room. Why should I call 911 for a business consultant who's having a minor fainting spell? Unless, of course, there's something in her system that shouldn't be there. Kaylin looked up at me, and in that moment, he knew. He knew I'd found the vial. He knew I'd swapped the glasses. He knew that the masterpiece of a crime he'd spent months planning had just become his own executioner's song. You, he hissed, his voice trembling with rage and fear. You did this. No, Kaylin, I said, standing up and smoothing my dress. You did this. I just made sure the right person was served. Lyra's breathing was becoming ragged, shallow. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. Kaylin was sobbing now, trying to perform CPR, but he was doing it wrong, his panic making his movements useless. Call them, he begged. Please, Alara, I'll give you everything. The company, the house, just save her. You already gave me everything the moment you put that vial in the drawer. Kaylin, I said, but don't worry. I'm not a monster. I've already called the authorities. They should be here in about 3 minutes, along with the private investigators I hired to document your little vitamins you've been giving me. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a low hum that grew into a piercing scream. Kaylin collapsed over Lyra's body, his world ending in the middle of a dining room that used to be a place of love. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. The blue and red lights were dancing against the trees. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the company. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. But as the paramedics burst through the door, I realized that the collapse of Lyra Thorne was only the first domino. Because Kaylin Vance had more secrets than just an amber vial. And as the police started asking questions about the apple juice, I realized that the real dinner party was only just beginning. I watched the paramedics lift Lyra onto the gurney. Her face was a mask of gray, her youth and model perfection wiped away by the poison intended for me. Kaylin was being held back by a young officer, his screams reduced to a pathetic whimpering. He kept looking at me, his eyes wide and pleading, as if I could somehow wave a wand and undo the last hour. But I just stood there, the grieving wife, my eyes wet with shock, clutching a lace handkerchief that I'd prepared, specifically for this performance. It was just juice, Kaylin was babbling to the officer. We were just having dinner. I don't know what happened. She just fell. We'll need to take the pitcher and the glasses, sir, the officer said, his voice firm. Standard procedure when someone collapses like this. I watched as they bagged the crystal pitcher. I watched as they bagged the placed in an Otace chipped glass. Kaylin's eyes followed that glass like it was a ticking bomb. He knew that once the lab ran the tests, the sedative would be found. And he knew that he was the only one who had been in the kitchen. But Kaylin was a man who had spent his life navigating the shadows of corporate law. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. As they led him toward the blank police cruiser just for a statement, he leaned in close to me. "You think you won, Alara?" he whispered, his voice like a serpent's rattle. "You think you're the only one who knows how to audit? Check the Vance logistics. Offshore accounts. Check the signatures on the 2022 audits. If I go down, the Vance name goes down with me. Your grandfather's legacy will be a footnote in a fraud case." He was pulled away before I could respond, his smirk returning for a fleeting, jagged second. I stood on the porch, watching the taillights fade, and I felt a new kind of chill. Kalen wasn't just a murderer in training. He was a saboteur. He had been hollowed out the company from the inside, and he'd used my name to do it. I walked back into the house. It felt haunted now. The smell of the sea base was still in the air, a grotesque reminder of the dinner that never was. I went straight to his office. I didn't need a key anymore. The police had left the door ajar after their brief sweep. I sat in his chair. I opened the burner phone. I looked at the messages again, but this time I looked past the "I love yous" and the "soon will be free." I looked for numbers. I looked for dates. And that's when I found the file labeled Project Phoenix. It wasn't a merger plan. It was a liquidation strategy. Kalen had been systematically transferring Vance Logistics assets into a shell company called Thorne and Associates. Lyra Thorne wasn't just a mistress. She was the primary shareholder of the company that was currently eating mine. The vial wasn't just about the money. It was about the silence. If I died, Kalen would inherit my shares, merge the two companies, and the fraud would be buried under the restructuring of a grieving widower. It was perfect. It was elegant. But Lyra Thorne was currently in a coma, and the police had a spiked glass of juice. My phone buzzed. It was a text from the hospital. "Patient stabilized, but neurological damage is uncertain. Toxicology confirmed high levels of a person. Restricted sedative." I closed my eyes. The battle for my life was over, but the battle for my life, soul, and my grandfather's legacy was just beginning. I had 72 hours before the Vance Logistics Board met to discuss the unfortunate incident at the CEO's house. 72 hours to find where Kalen had hidden the stolen millions before he could pin it all on me. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the small wooden box my grandmother had left me before she passed. She'd told me to open it only when the house felt like it was made of paper. Inside was a single old-fashioned brass key and a note in her elegant, shaky script. "The garage was only the beginning, Alara. The real foundation is in the dirt." I knew exactly what she meant. The old garage in the Albuquerque desert. The original site. Kalen thought he'd audited everything, but he didn't know about the basement beneath the garage. He didn't know about the physical ledgers my grandfather kept long after the world went digital. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the house. I didn't look back at the stained tablecloth or the empty chairs. I had a long drive ahead of me, and a ghost to consult. As I pulled onto the highway, I realized that Kalen Vance had spiked my juice because he thought I was the weakness in the company. He thought my love for the legacy made me blind. But love doesn't make you blind. It makes you vigilant. And as the sun began to rise over the desert, I realized that the juice wasn't the only thing that had been spiked. The entire Vance empire was poisoned, and I was the only one with the antidote. The desert road felt like a ritual, a long black ribbon of penance cutting through the scorched earth of New Mexico. The hum of the tires against the puckened asphalt was the only thing keeping the silence from crushing me. Albuquerque was 8 hours away, 8 hours of flickering shadows and the ghost of Kalen's voice rattling in the backseat of my mind. I kept seeing him in the kitchen, the sunlight hitting the amber vial just right, his fingers steady so incredibly. Steady as he prepared a death sentence for the woman he had promised to honor. He hadn't just tried to kill me, he had tried to replace me with a transaction. As the miles bled into one another, my thoughts drifted to Silas Vance, the man who had breathed life into a fleet of 3 battered trucks and turned them into an empire. Silas was a man of iron and salt. He didn't believe in offshore accounts or digital encryption. He believed in things you could touch, things you could defend with a shotgun if necessary. He had taught me that a company isn't its stock price, it's the trust of the drivers, the integrity of the route, and the silence of the ledgers. The dirt doesn't lie, Alara. he'd told me when I was 12, standing in that very garage in the middle of a dust storm. Men will paint over their sins with fancy words, but the ground remembers where the oil was spilled. I arrived at the site just as the sun was beginning to bleed out over the horizon, turning the sky into a bruise of purple and gold. The garage was a skeletal remains of a building, the corrugated metal roof flapping in the wind, like a dying bird's wing. It had been years since any Vance trucks had rolled through here. Kalen had wanted to sell the land for a suburban development, but I'd fought him. I told him it was for the sentimental value. He'd laughed, called me a relic hunter, and let it go. He didn't know that the land was the only place he hadn't managed to scrub clean. I stepped out of the car, the heat still radiating from the ground. My heels clicked against the cracked concrete, a sound that felt too sharp for such a blank 21, desolate place. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It felt heavy, vibrating, with a history I was only just beginning to understand. The garage door groaned as I forced it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old grease, rust, and the oppressive weight of the past. I moved to the Enery's Ants 20-0, back corner, near the old workbench where Silas used to spend his nights. I pushed aside a stack of rotted wooden pallets, my hands trembling as I searched for the seam in the concrete. There it was, a hairline fracture in the floor that didn't match the natural settling of the building. I inserted the brass key into a hole hidden behind a rusted pipe. With a grinding sound that made my teeth ache, a small section of the floor retracted, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down into the dark. I clicked on my flashlight and descended. The basement was cool, the walls made of thick, hand-poured concrete. It was a time capsule. On a heavy oak desk sat a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and faded. These were Silas's shadow books, the real record of how Vance Logistics had survived the lean years of the 70s and 80s. I opened the top ledger, my eyes scanning the handwritten entries. For the first hour, it was exactly what I expected. Fuel costs, driver bonuses, bribes to local sheriffs. But as I reached the final pages, the handwriting changed. It wasn't Silas's anymore. It was Kalen's. I felt a surge of nausea. Kalen had found this place. He hadn't just audited the digital files. He had come here to the heart of the family legacy, and he had used Silas's own shadow system to facilitate Project Phoenix. The entries were cold, precise, and devastating. He wasn't just liquidating the company, he was using it as a laundry for a massive international smuggling ring. Vance Logistics trucks weren't just carrying medical supplies and dry goods. They were the primary transport for high-end black market tech and untraceable currency moving between the coast and the border. Kalen had turned my grandfather's life's work into a getaway car for the world's elite criminals. And every single delivery was signed off by a digital ghost that bore my name. He didn't just want to kill me, I whispered into the dark. He wanted to frame me for the death of the company. If I had died at that dinner, the investigators would have found these ledgers. They would have seen my signatures, the shell companies in my name, and the offshore accounts Lyra Thorne had been managing. I wouldn't have just been a victim. I would have been the most successful white-collar criminal in the Stadion 5 Lees Leschenstein state, a woman who took her husband's love and used it to fund a criminal empire, before taking her own life out of guilt. The sheer scale of the malice was breathtaking. I leaned against the desk, my Tussa's lashed flashlight beam dancing over the pages. He had planned every move, every health smoothie, every business consultant visit. Lyra Thorne wasn't just a mistress. She was the architect of the digital frame. Kalen provided the access, and Lyra provided the technical brilliance to make the trail lead directly to me. But then, I heard it, the soft crunch of gravel outside. I killed the flashlight and moved to the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. A car door closed. Not a police siren, not a tow truck. It was a single, heavy click. Ilara? The voice was smooth, familiar, and utterly terrifying. It was Thorne, not Lyra, but her brother, Cassian Thorne. He was Kalen's fixer, the man who handled the irregularities at the warehouse. If Lyra was the brain and Kalen was the face, Cassian was the muscle. "I know you're here, Ilara," Cassian called out, his voice echoing through the freckless garage. Kalen called me from the station. He was very concerned about your Sudden interest in Albuquerque. He thought you might be looking for something you're not prepared to carry. I backed away from the stairs, my eyes darting around the basement. There was no other exit. I was trapped in Silas's vault with the evidence of my own framing, and a man who was paid to make problems disappear. Kalen's a romantic, Alara, Cassian continued, his footsteps now heavy on the foam. Garage floor above me. He wanted to do it with the juice, nice and quiet. Tragic accident for a tragic woman. But I told him, life is rarely that clean. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty. I saw his shadow fall across the opening of the stairs. He was holding something in his hand, a silenced pistol, its long barrel glinting in the moonlight, filtering through the garage roof. He told me to bring the ledgers back, Alara, and to make sure you didn't have to worry about the company anymore. It's for the best, really. You were never built for this world. I looked at the desk, at the heavy oak ledgers. Silas had built this place to be a fortress. I reached down and felt the underside of the desk. My fingers brushed a cold metal lever, the one Silas told me about, the one he said was for emergencies only. I pulled it. A loud hydraulic hiss filled the room. The stairs didn't collapse. Instead, a heavy steel door, disguised as a tool rack on the garage floor, slammed shut, sealing the basement. I heard Cassian curse as the door nearly took off his feet. He began to pound on the metal, the muffled thuds vibrating through the concrete. I was safe, for now, but I was buried alive. I sat on the floor, the flashlight back on, illuminating the ledgers. I had the evidence. I had the truth. But Cassian was above me, and the air in the basement wouldn't last forever. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The concrete was too thick. I went back to the ledgers, searching for something, anything that could give me leverage. I flipped to the very last page of the final book. There was a single phone number written in Silas's handwriting, dated only a week before he died. Underneath it, a name, the auditor. I didn't know who it was, but Silas didn't write things down unless they were vital. I realized then that the shadow books weren't just Kalen's crimes. They were also the insurance policies Silas had kept against anyone who tried to take the company by force. I looked around the room. In the corner, there was an old ham radio, its vacuum, tubes dusty but intact. Silas was a prepper before the word existed. He had an independent power source, a hand-cranked generator hidden in the wall. I began to crank. The physical exertion was a relief, a way to channel the terror into something productive. Slowly, the radio began to glow. The hum of the electronics filled the room, a low, buzzing lifeline. I tuned it to the frequency Silas had noted next to the phone number. I keyed. The mic. "This is Alara Vance," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm at the Albuquerque site. The house is made of paper, and the wolves are at the door. I have the shadow. Books. Does the auditor still collect?" Silence. Only the static of the desert night. I repeated the message, over and over, while above me, the sound of a drill began to whine. Cassian was trying to bypass the steel door. He was going to cut his way in, and when he did, the truth would be burned along with me. "Please," I whispered to the radio. Silas said the ground remembers. "Tell me, someone is listening." Suddenly, the static broke. "We collect, Alara," a woman's voice whispered through the speakers. Cold, professional, and ancient. "And Silas Vance's accounts are long overdue for a clearing. Stay where you are. The wind is changing." The drill above stopped. I heard a muffled shout, then the sound of several engines roaring to life outside. There was a flurry of gunfire, sharp, popping sounds that felt miles away, and then a heavy silence. I waited, my hand still on the radio, my heart stopping with every beat. The steel door began to move again. It groaned as it was lifted from the outside. I stood up, clutching the ledgers to my chest, ready to fight, ready to die. But as the light flooded into the basement, it wasn't Cassian Thorne standing at the top of the stairs. It was a woman in a dark suit, her hair silver, her eyes like flint. She looked exactly like the portraits of the city's founding judges, but there was a hardness to her that suggested she operated far outside the courtroom. "I'm Hera," she said, her voice the same one from the radio. "And your grandfather owed me a very big favor, Alara. It seems he intended for you to be the one to cash it in." She stepped aside, and I saw Cassian Thorne being led away in zip ties by men who didn't look like police. They looked like ghosts, untouchable, nameless, and lethal. Kaylin Vance is currently being moved to a federal facility, Hera said as Stina helped me up the stairs. The juice incident was a clumsy play. But the logistics of Project Phoenix? That's treason. You've done well to find this. Alara. Most people would have just died in the dining room. I stepped out into the desert air, the cold wind hitting my face. I looked back. At the garage, at the ruin of my family's beginning. What happens now? I asked. Now, Hera said, looking at the ledgers in my arms. We audit, and we make sure that by the time we're done, the name Kaylin Vance is erased from every record, every bank, and every memory in this city. But you should know, Alara Lyra. Thorne woke up, and she's already started talking. She says the juice wasn't Kaylin's idea. She says it was yours. I froze. Lyra was awake, and she was doubling down on the frame. She was going to say that I was the one who poisoned her to cover up my crimes at Vance. Logistics. I looked at the silver-haired woman. And do you believe her? Hera smiled, a thin, dangerous line. It doesn't matter what I believe, Alara. It matters what the books say. Let's see if your grandfather's shadow is long enough to cover you. We drove away from the garage, the dust rising behind us like a shroud. I looked at the ledgers on my lap. The game had changed again. It wasn't just about surviving Kaylin. It was about surviving the very empire Silas had built. Because as I flipped to the very back of the ledger one more time, I saw a final note from my grandfather, one I'd missed in the dark. Alara, if you're reading this, you've found the truth. But remember, Hera doesn't work for me. She works for the debt. And the debt always takes the debt. House. I looked at the woman driving the car. She wasn't my savior. She was the repo man. And the dinner party was about to get much, much more expensive. Hera's profile was a study in stillness, a sharp contrast to the chaotic storm raging in my chest. We were heading back toward the city, but the route was different. A series of back roads that felt intentionally designed to avoid any prying eyes. The ledgers sat like lead on my knees, the physical weight of every secret Silas had kept and every crime Kaylin had committed. Why did he keep that note about you? I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the luxury SUV. If you're the debt, why did he point me toward you? Hera didn't take her eyes off the road. Because Silas Vance was a man who understood that sometimes you have to burn the field to save the soil. He knew that one day, the company would become too bloated with its own greed. He knew that someone like Kaylin, a man with a hollow soul and a sharp mind, would eventually find the keys. I'm the failsafe, Alara. I'm the one who makes sure that when the empire falls, it doesn't crush the innocent. But innocent is a sliding scale in this business. I didn't know about any of this, I insisted. The smuggling, the offshore, accounts. I was building the logistics software. I was managing the fleet. I didn't see the shadows. That's why you were the perfect cover, Hera replied. Your competence provided the light that made Kaylin's shadows possible. Lyra Thorne understood that. That's why she's currently telling a federal prosecutor that you were the mastermind. She's painting a picture of a brilliant, jilted woman who used her technical skills to build a shadow empire, and her husband's infidelity as a convenient excuse to eliminate her partner in crime. I have the vial, I said, my voice rising. I have the toxicology report. He tried to kill me. A jilted wife poisoning her husband's mistress? That's a motive, Alara, not a defense. In the eyes of a jury, you found out about the affair, realized Lyra, was moving in on your territory, and decided to take her out. The fact that the sedative came from Kaylin's drawer, you'll say he put it there. Lyra will say, you put it there to frame him. It's her word against yours. And right now, she has the benefit of being the one who almost died. The sheer brilliance of the countermove made my head spin. They had anticipated my survival, or at least, Lyra had. She was the one who'd played the allergic card at dinner, making sure there was a record of her being vulnerable. If I hadn't swapped the glasses, I'd be dead. Because I had swapped them, I was a murderer in the making. So how did the books save me? I asked, clutching the leather-bound ledgers. The books show the money trail, Hera said. They show that the shell companies Lyra managed were funded long before Kaylin ever met you. They show that Silas was paying me to watch the Thorne family for 3 decades. The Thornes have Been a parasite on the logistics industry since the 50s. Silas knew it. He let them in so he could keep them close, but he never let them win. These ledgers are a map of their lineage of fraud. If we can prove that Lyra's pros involvement predates your marriage, her mastermind story falls apart. We arrived at a safe house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, a modern, glass and stone structure tucked into the side of a mountain. It looked like a fortress disguised as an architectural marvel. Hera led me inside, where a team of people, none of whom looked like they existed on any census, were already setting up workstations. We have 12 hours, Hera said, gesturing to the ledgers. The Board of Vance. Logistics is meeting at noon tomorrow. Kalen's lawyers are already drafting a plausics. A motion to have you removed and your shares frozen pending the investigation into the poisoning. If we don't have a counterstrike by then, you'll be arrested. The moment you step into that boardroom, I sat down at a long table, the ledgers spread out before me. I wasn't a forensic accountant, but I knew the Vance system better than anyone alive. I began to work, my fingers flying over the pages, my mind back in the Albuquerque basement. I looked for the name Thorne. It appeared early, in the 1984 ledger. Silas had been paying a man named Elias Thorne, Lyra's father, for consulting services. But when I cross-referenced the dates with the company's old delivery logs, I saw the pattern. Elias wasn't a consultant. He was a black market broker. Every time Silas made a payment to Elias, a Vance truck would go missing for 48 hours. The theft would be covered by insurance, and Silas would get a kickback. It was a small-time grift back then, a way to keep the trucks running during the recession. But as I moved into the 90s, the payments grew, and the names changed. Lyra wasn't just Kalen's mistress. She was the second generation of a criminal dynasty that had been eating Vance Logistics from the inside for 40 years. I found a document tucked into the back of the 1998 ledger. It was a birth certificate, Lyra Thorne's, but the father's name wasn't Elias Thorne. It was Silas Vance. The air left my lungs. I stared at the paper. The ink faded, but the truth screaming off the page. Lyra wasn't just a mistress. She was my half-aunt, or my father's half-sister. She was a Vance. Silas had an affair with Elias Thorne's wife. He had fathered Lyra and then spent the rest of his life paying the Thornes to keep her away from the legacy. Kalen hadn't found a mistress. He had found the one person with a legitimate, albeit hidden, claim to the company. He hadn't been cheating on me for sex. He'd been partnering with Lyra to reclaim what she believed was her birthright. They weren't liquidating the stock of company. They were purifying it. They wanted to strip me the legitimate heir of everything and give it back to the shadow branch of the family. Hera! I choked out, my voice trembling. Look at this. Hera walked over and looked at the birth certificate. For the first time, her flinty eyes widened. Well, she whispered, that changes the debt significantly. Silas didn't just owe me a favor for the company. He owed me a favor for his soul. Lyra knows, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She knows she's a Vance. That's why she's so confident. She doesn't just want the money, she wants the name. And Kalen was going to marry her once I was gone. He'd still be CEO, and they'd have the pure Vance bloodline back at the Bryant helm. It's not just fraud, it's a coup. And a poisoning, Hera added. If Lyra is a Vance, the board will be much more sympathetic to her. A long-lost daughter, nearly killed by the jealous, fraudulent granddaughter? It's a Shakespearean tragedy that the media will eat up. Kalen isn't just a murderer, he's a kingmaker. I looked at the clock. 6 hours until the board meeting. 6 hours to decide if I was going to fight for a legacy that was built on a lie, or if I was going to let it all burn. Silas told me the dirt doesn't lie, I said, looking at the silver-haired woman. He was right. The dirt is filthy, but I'm a Vance too. And if this company's going to fall, I'm the one who's going to strike the match. I turned back to the computer. Hera, I need you to find the record of the GATA health smoothies Kalen was giving me. Not the ones he spiked with the sedative, but the ones he gave me for the 3 months prior. I think he was microdosing me with something else. Something to make me look unstable. Something to justify a breakdown if the poisoning didn't work. We're on it, Hera said. As they worked, I went back to the ledgers. I found one final entry in the very back of the shadow books. It was a list of names, the board of directors. Next to each name was a number and a date. Silas hadn't just kept a shadow book of his own crimes. He'd kept one of theirs. Every single member of the Vance Logistics Board had been bought and paid for by Silas Vance at some point in their careers. He hadn't built a company, he'd built a blackmail ring. I realized then why Kalen was so confident he could frame me. He hadn't just audited the company, he'd inherited the blackmail. He knew the board wouldn't vote against him because he had the same numbers Silas had. But Kalen didn't have the ledgers. I did. Hera, I said, my voice cold and certain. I don't need a lawyer for the board meeting. I need a projector. And I need a very large shredder. Because by the time I'm done, there isn't going to be a board left to vote. The drive back to the city was a blur of neon and caffeine. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline was a hum in my veins that wouldn't let me rest. We pulled up to the Vance Logistics headquarters, a towering glass monolith that felt like a granite tomb. I walked through the lobby, Hera and her ghosts behind me. The security guards, they tried to stop us, but Hera simply showed them a card that made them step back as if they'd been burned. I reached the boardroom on the top floor. I could hear the voices. Inside Kalen's lawyer, the board members, the hushed whispers of a funeral. I pushed the doors open. The room went silent. 12 men and women in tailored suits looked at me as if I were a ghost. At the head of the table sat Kalen's lead counsel, a man named Sterling Vane. Mrs. Vance, Sterling said, his voice smooth and condescending. This is a private meeting. You are no longer authorized to be here. We were just discussing the tragic events of the last few days and the evidence linking you to the attempted murder of Lyra Thorne. I'm sure you were, Sterling, I said, walking to the head of the table. I placed the leather-bound ledgers on the polished wood with a heavy thud. But before you vote on my removal, I think we should talk about the history of this table, and specifically, the price Silas Vance paid for each of your seats. I looked at the chairman of the board, a man who had been my grandfather's closest friend. How's the villa in Tuscany, Arthur? The one Silas bought you. In 1992, after the accidental fire at the Jersey warehouse, Arthur turned the color of ash. I looked at the head of the audit committee. And you, Margaret, does your husband know about the offshore accounts Silas set up to cover your gambling debts in Macau? The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I'm not here to talk about a poisoning, I said, my voice echoing in the vast space. I'm here to talk about the debt. Lyra Thorne is Silas Vance's daughter. She and Kylan tried to kill me to take over this company. They used your pasts to ensure your silence. But I have the books, and I don't care about your silence. I opened the ledger to the page with the board's names. You have two choices. You can vote to dissolve Vance Logistics today, liquidate all assets, and turn the evidence of Project Phoenix over to the feds, in which case I might forget to mention your individual consulting fees to the auditor. I looked at Hera, who was standing by the door like a silent reaper. Or, I continued, you can try to remove me. And by 5 o'clock tonight, every major news outlet in the country will have a digital copy of these shadow books. You won't just be out of a job. You'll be in a cell next to Kalen. Sterling Vane stood up, his face contorted with rage. This is blackmail. You're no better than Silas. No, Sterling, I said, leaning over the table. I'm much worse. Silas wanted to keep the legacy alive. I just want to see it die with some dignity. Arthur looked at the other board members. He saw the terror in their eyes. He saw the silver-haired woman at the door. He knew that the game Silas had started 60 years ago was finally over. What do you want us to do, Alara? Arthur whispered. Vote, I said. Dissolve the company. Return the stolen funds to the victims of the smuggling ring. And then, I want you all to resign. Every single one of you. They voted. It was unanimous. The Vance Empire, 60 years of greed and secrets, was dismantled in less than 10 minutes. I walked out of the boardroom, the ledgers under my arm. I felt a strange sense of peace. The weight was gone. The house of paper had finally burned. I went to the hospital to see Lyra. She was awake, her face pale, and her eyes filled with a bitter, jagged light. She saw me walk in and she tried to snarl, but the tubes in her throat made it a pathetic rasp. I know, Lyra, I said, standing by her bed. I know who you are, and I know What you tried to do. But the company is gone. There's nothing left to inherit. Kylan is going to prison for the rest of his life. And you? You're going to be a footnote in a fraud case, just like Kaylin said. I leaned in close. I swapped the glasses because I'm a Vance. But I'm the kind of Vance that Silas should have been. I'm the one who clears the debt. I walked out of the hospital and into the bright city afternoon. Hera was waiting for me by the car. The books are in the shredder, Alara, she said. The auditor is satisfied. Silas Vance's soul is finally his own again. And what about me? I asked. You? Hera smiled. You have the Albuquerque land, and you have the software. You're free, Alara. Just don't forget the lesson. The dirt doesn't lie, but the fruit is only as good as the tree. I looked up at the glass tower. It didn't look like an empire anymore. It just looked like a building. I got in the car and drove away. The juice, the safe, sweet juice of a new beginning waiting for me at the end of the road. But as I reached the edge of the city, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered it. Elara? It was Kalen's voice. He sounded calm, almost cheerful. You think it's over? Check the smoothie vials one more time, darling. The sedative wasn't for you. It was for Lyra. I knew you'd swap them. I knew you were watching. I didn't want to kill you, Elara. I wanted you to kill her for me. I wanted the frame to be real. And now, the police have a video of you swapping those glasses from the hidden camera in the dining room clock. Happy. Auditing my love, the car swerved as I slammed on the brakes. The dinner party wasn't over. It was a hall of mirrors. And I was still standing in the center, holding the smoking gun. The silence that followed Kalen's voice was a vacuum, sucking the air out of Kalen's voice. The car. I sat there, the engine idling, the desert wind whistling through the say. Slightly cracked window. He was still playing. Even from a cell, even with his empire in ruins, Kalen Vance was the master of the long game. I had been so proud of my vigilance, so certain of my audit, that I had walked right into the very trap I thought I was disarming. I looked at the passenger seat where the ledgers had sat only moments ago. Hera had taken them to be destroyed. I was vulnerable. I had no leverage left against the man who had just admitted to orchestrating a murder through my own hands. Hera, I whispered, reaching for my phone. But before I could dial, I saw the glazed black sedan pull up behind me. Not Hera's SUV. A plain, nondescript government vehicle. 2 men stepped out. They weren't ghosts. They were wearing windbreakers with FBI stenciled in yellow across the back. My heart didn't just race. It felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my tortillé throat. I looked at the glove box. I had the toxicology report, but Kalen said there was a video of me swapping the glasses. In the eyes of the law, that wasn't self-defense. That was premeditation. I had known the juice was poisoned, and instead of calling the police, I had served it to another person. Alara Vance? The taller of the 2 agents said, tapping on my window. We need you to come with us. We've received some new evidence regarding the incident at your residence. I didn't resist. There was no point. I stepped out of the car, the cold handcuffs snapping around my wrists with a finality that made the Albuquerque desert seem like a paradise I'd already lost. The interrogation room was exactly as bleak as the movies suggest. A metal table, a single flickering light, and a stack of folders that contained the wreckage of my life. Agent Miller, the one who had arrested me, sat across the table, his face unreadable. Your husband's lawyers just handed us a digital file, Mrs. Vance, Miller said, sliding a tablet toward me. It's from a covert security system installed in your dining room. Kalen says he put it there because he was worried about your mental state and the threats you'd been making toward his staff. He pressed play. I watched myself. I looked calm, almost robotic. I saw Kalen leave the room. I saw myself stand up. I saw the swap. The camera angle was perfect. It caught the chipped base of the glass as it moved from my place to Lyra's. It looked like a professional hit. There was no hesitation, no fear. Just a woman cold-bloodedly ensuring her rival took the poison. Kalen claims he prepared that juice for himself, Miller continued. He says he's been struggling with insomnia and was using a mild sedative prescribed by an offshore doctor. He says you knew about the sedative, and you chose to use it as a weapon against his mistress. He's lying, I said, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. He was microdosing me for months. He wanted me dead so he could merge the company with Lyra's Shell Corporations. I have the toxicology report of the smoothie he made me that morning. We checked the smoothies in your fridge, Mrs. Vance, Miller said, leaning forward. They were clean. In fact, they were filled with high-end organic supplements. There was no trace of any sedative or neurotoxin in your kitchen, other than the residue in the glass Lyra Thorne drank from. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Kalen hadn't microdosed the smoothies he'd left in the fridge. He'd only microdosed the ones he'd watched. Making me drink. He'd made sure that if the police ever checked our home, they'd only find a doting husband providing health drinks for his unstable wife. And the amber vial? I asked. I found it in his desk. The desk was empty, Mrs. Vance. Your husband's fixer, Cassian Thorne, seems to have done a very thorough job of cleaning the house while you were on your way to Albuquerque. The only thing we found was the video and Lyra Thorne's testimony. Lyra's a Vance, I shouted. She's Silas's daughter. She was in on it. Miller sighed, a sound of weary pity. We ran the DNA, Mrs. Vance. Lyra Thorne is exactly who she says she is, a logistics consultant from New York. There is no biological link to Silas Vance. That birth certificate you found? Our experts say it's a sophisticated forgery, one that was found in your possession. I sat back, the world spinning, the ledgers, the birth certificate, the secret, basement. It was all part of the frame. Kalen hadn't just audited the company. He had built a fictional history for me to find. He had lured me to Albuquerque, so I would be found with forged documents and the stolen ledgers. Hera. I looked at Miller, the woman who was with me. Hera. She saw everything. She has the ledgers. We don't know any Hera, Mrs. Vance. The security footage from the Albuquerque garage shows you entering alone. It shows you coming out alone, carrying a box of old papers that were later found burned in a ditch 2 miles away. There were no other vehicles on the road that night. I felt the walls closing in. Hera wasn't a savior. She wasn't the auditor. She was the final piece of Kalen's masterpiece. She was an actress, a professional, fixer who had played the role of a legendary Vance contact to lead me right to the edge of the cliff. She hadn't destroyed the evidence. She had destroyed my defense. I was alone, in a room with a video of a crime I had technically committed, and no way to prove the malice behind it. You're facing 20 years to life, Mrs. Vance, Miller said, closing the folder. Unless you're willing to talk about the Project Phoenix's funds. Kalen says you moved them. He says he found the shell accounts in your name and was, I'm going to confront you that night at dinner. He says the merger with Lyra was his blank Talton attempt to save the company from your embezzlement. I started to laugh. It was a jagged, hysterical sound that filled the blank interrogation room. Kalen Vance had taken my grandfather's legacy, my own work, and my survival instinct, and he had woven them into a noose. He wasn't just erasing me, he was making me the villain of his story. I want to see him, I said, my laughter dying into a cold, hard ember of spite. I want to see my husband. That's not a good idea, Miller said. I'm the only one who knows where the physical keys to the New Mexico warehouse are. I lied, my voice steadying. Silas didn't just use ledgers. He used a physical vault for the high-end tech. Kalen doesn't have the keys. I do. And if I'm going to prison, those warehouses are going to stay locked until they rot. Unless I talk to Kalen. Miller hesitated. The FBI wanted the smuggling tech. They wanted the Project Phoenix evidence. 10 minutes, Miller said, monitored. They brought Kalen into the room. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, but he wore it with the same arrogance he'd worn his tailored suits. He sat down, his gray eyes sparkling with a dark, triumphant joy. Hello, Alara, he whispered. You look tired. Did the desert air not agree with you? You're good, Kalen, I said, leaning over the table as far as my cuffs would. Allow. The video. The fake birth certificate. Hera. It was a beautiful piece of work. I knew you were too smart to just die, Alara, Kalen said, his voice a purr of admiration. I knew you'd find the vial. I knew you'd swap the glasses. You've always been so predictable in your strength. I just had to give you the stage to perform on. And Lyra? You really poisoned the woman you were sleeping with just to frame me? Kaylin shrugged. Lyra was a tool, a talented one, but she was getting greedy. She actually believed the Project Phoenix's money was hers. She was becoming a liability. Framing you with her death solved two problems at once. I get the company, I get the money, and I get to be the tragic hero who survived a murderous wife. But I disillusion the company, Kaylin. The board voted. Kaylin laughed. The board has no power to dissolve a company that is currently under federal seizure for your crimes, Alara. Their vote is meaningless. Once you're convicted, the company reverts to me as the sole remaining honest officer. I've already been cleared of the smuggling charges. I was the whistleblower who tipped off the FBI about your shell companies, remember? He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of the same peppermint he always used. You lost, Alara. Silas's dirt finally swallowed you. There's one thing you forgot, Kaylin, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. That the monitors wouldn't catch. Silas didn't just teach me about the dirt. He taught me about the shadow. I reached into my mouth and pulled out a small, translucent film from behind my molar. I'd hidden it there when I saw the FBI cars. It was a micro SD card, encased in medical-grade plastic. The ham radio in the basement, I whispered. It wasn't just a receiver. It was a recorder. Every word Cassian Thorne said in that garage. Every word about the etches occluder. Juice being your idea. Every word about your irregularities is on this card. Silas built that radio to record the frequencies of the local sheriffs. I just repurposed it. Kaylin's face didn't drain of color. It froze. You're lying, he hissed. Cassian would have seen it. Cassian was too busy trying to drill through a steel door, I said. And Hera? She was a great actress, Kaylin, but you should have checked her credentials more carefully. She doesn't work for the debt. She works for me. Kaylin's eyes darted to the door. I hired Hera 6 months ago. I lied a beautiful, desperate lie. I knew you. We're planning something. I knew you were talking to Lyra. I let you build the frame because I needed you to admit to the smuggling on a federal wire. Why do you think the FBI was at the garage so fast? Why do you think they let me swap? The glasses? They needed the video of you preparing the picture. Kaylin looked at the micro SD card in my hand. His arrogance was cracking, the first fissures appearing in the mask of the hero. If that card has Cassian's voice, it has everything, I said. It has the truth. And it has the auditor's real identity. You think Silas Vance was a small-time grifter? He was the auditor. Kaylin. He was the one who ran the shadow system for the whole state. And I just inherited the books. Miller stepped into the room. Time's up, Vance. I stood up, the handcuffs feeling lighter. I didn't have a micro SD card with Cassian's voice. I had a blank card from my camera. But Kaylin didn't know that. And a man as paranoid as Kaylin Vance wouldn't be able to handle the doubt. As they led him away, I saw him start to babble. He started to point fingers at Cassian, at the board, at the real masterminds of Project Phoenix. He was so terrified of the shadow books that he began to tear down his own masterpiece, just to find a way out. I sat back in the interrogation room and waited. 2 hours later, Miller came back. He looked stunned. Kaylin Vance just gave a full confession, Miller said. He's naming names. He admitted to the smuggling, the embezzlement, and the poisoning. He says he was coerced by Cassian Thorne, but he's giving us everything we need to bury the whole operation. And the video? I asked. He admitted the video was staged. He admitted he knew you'd swap the glasses, and he wanted to use it as leverage. We're dropping the charges against you. Mrs. Vance, you're free to go. I walked out of the FBI headquarters and into the cool Albuquerque night. The desert air smelled like sage and rain. I looked at the micro SD card in my hand and dropped it into a storm drain. Hera was waiting for me in the parking lot. The real Hera. She wasn't an actress, and she wasn't Kaylin's fixer. She was exactly who she said she was. Debt collector Silas had kept on retainer. You played a dangerous game, Alara, Hera said, opening the car door. If Kaylin hadn't been a coward, that blank card would have been your death. Warrant. I'm a Vance, Hera, I said, getting into the car. We're all cowards at heart. We just cover it up with better suits. What now? Now, I said, looking at the city lights. I go home. I finish my juice. And I start a new company, one without shadows. But as we drove away, I thought about the dining room clock. Kaylin had been right about one thing: the video was real. And as I watched the desert fade into the distance, I wondered if I'd really cleared the debt, or if I'd just become the new auditor. Because in the Vance family, the dirt doesn't lie. But the silence? The silence is where the real money is. The mansion smelled like cold sea bass and the metallic tang of old fear. I stood in the center of the foyer, the silence pressing against my eardrums until it felt like the walls were whispering Kaylin's name. Even with the FBI's yellow tape gone and the cleaners having scrubbed the Persian rug until the fibers were injured too by BAS. Raw, the house didn't belong to me anymore. It was a hollow shell, a monument to a marriage that had been a 7-year interrogation. I walked toward the blank kitchen, my heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to the next catastrophe. I opened the refrigerator. There, sitting on the middle shelf, was a fresh glass of apple juice. My heart seized. I hadn't made it. The staff had been dismissed days ago. I backed away, my breath hitching, and that was when I saw her. Hera was sitting at the breakfast nook, her silver hair gleaming under the recessed lighting. She was holding a paring knife, slowly peeling an apple in one continuous, perfect spiral. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Alara," she said, not looking up. "But ghosts don't make juice. Only friends do." "How did you get in here?" I asked, my voice trembling. The security codes. The security codes were written by a man who thought he was clever. To someone like me, they're just suggestions. Hera finally looked at me, her flinty eyes assessing the damage. "You did well in the interrogation room." The blank SD card was a nice touch, a bit desperate, but effective against a man like Kaylin. But you should know that a confession under duress is a flimsy thing. His lawyers are already filing to suppress it. "He admitted to everything," I said, leaning against the counter. "The smuggling, the poisoning. He's finished." "He's in a holding cell," Hera corrected, the apple peel falling to the plate in a wet heap. "But Kaylin Vance isn't the one who owes the debt. Silas is. And since Silas is in the ground and Kaylin is in chains, that leaves only you." "I disillusioned the company, Hera. I gave the money back. What more could you possibly want?" Hera stood up, the knife glinting. "You think Vance Logistics was about money? Silas was a courier of secrets, Alara. The Project Phoenix's smuggling was just the latest iteration of a system that has been running for half a century. There is a ledger, a real one, not the shadow books you found in the desert, that contains the identities of everyone who has ever used the Vance routes to move. Things they shouldn't have." "The Blue Ledger," I whispered. I remembered Silas mentioning it once, in a fever dream just before he died. He'd called it the Book of Endings. "If that ledger falls into federal hands, the city will burn," Hera said, walking toward me. "And if it falls into the hands of the people Kaylin was working for, you'll be dead before you can blink." Kaylin's confession was a distraction. He's hoping you'll lead us to it so his friends can intercept it. "They're watching you, Alara. They're watching this house." I looked toward the dark window, suddenly aware of the vastness of the estate. The trees looked like jagged teeth against the sky. I wasn't free. I was bait. "Where is it?" Hera asked. "I don't know," I lied. But even as I said it, I remembered the brass key I'd found in the Albuquerque basement. It had felt too heavy for a simple retracting floor. It had a hollow stem. "Silas told me the foundation is in the dirt," I said, my mind racing. But he didn't mean New Mexico. He meant here, the original Vance homestead, the cellar, where he kept his first truck. Hera's eyes narrowed. "The cellar was filled in 30 years ago when they built the pool house." "He wouldn't have filled it in," I said, a sudden clarity washing over me. "He would have built over it. The pool house isn't a guest house. It's a lid." I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. I didn't wait for Hera. I ran out into the night, the grass damp against my ankles. The pool house was a modern, minimalist structure at the far end of the property. I'd always hated it. It felt cold, out of place among the oak trees. I burst inside. The floor was polished concrete. I moved to the center, where a large, decorative bronze medallion of a compass was embedded in the ground. Silas had designed it himself. I knelt down and examined the north needle. There was a tiny indentation, the exact size of the hollow stem of the brass. K. I inserted the key and twisted. A heavy, mechanical thrum vibrated through the floorboards. The concrete didn't move, but the far wall, the one covered in expensive mahogany shelving, slid back. 6 inches. I pushed it, and a narrow, stone-lined passage appeared. It smelled of earth and something ancient. Wait, Hera said from the doorway. She was holding a gun now, but she wasn't pointing it at me. She was pointing it at the shadows behind the oak trees. I have company. The Thorns didn't go as quietly as the FBI thought. Out of the darkness, Cassian Thorne stepped into the light of the pool house. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his zip ties gone, replaced by a heavy-duty assault rifle. Behind him were 3 men I didn't recognize, their faces masked, their movements disciplined. The FBI's transport had an accident, Cassian rasped, his eyes fixed on the gaudy Aloda. Secret passage. Kylan's friends are very efficient, Alara. They don't like losing their ledgers. Move away from the wall. Hera fired. The sound was deafening in the small space. One of Cassian's men fell, but the return fire was a hail of lead that shattered the mahogany. Shelves. I scrambled into the passage, the stone walls scraping my shoulders as I dove into the dark. Alara, run! Hera shouted, her voice disappearing behind the thud of the stone. Door closing. I was alone in the tunnel. It sloped downward, deeper into the gut of the slow property. I could hear the muffled sounds of the gunfight above, the house I had once called home becoming a battlefield. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a small vaulted room. It wasn't a vault for gold. It was a library. Thousands of tiny, handwritten slips of paper were tucked into glass jars that lined the walls. This was the Vance Network, the physical record of every bribe, every package, and every soul Silas Vance had ever touched. And in the center, on a pedestal made of black basalt, sat a single blue leather book. I reached for it, my hands shaking. This was the debt. This was the favor for Silas's soul. I opened the first page. It wasn't a list of names. It was a confession. To my granddaughter, Alara. The company was never built on trucks. It was built on a sacrifice. In 1962, I didn't just start a logistics firm. I witnessed a murder. The murder of the man who actually owned the trucks. I took his name, I took his routes, and I took his life. Hera is the daughter of the man I killed. The debt isn't money. The debt is the truth. The blue book wasn't a weapon against Kaylin. It was a weapon against the Vance. Name. Silas hadn't been a courier of secrets. He had been a thief of a life. And Hera. Hera hadn't been watching the company for Silas. She had been hunting the Blenkslings man who killed her father for 50 years. So you found it, a voice said from the stairs. I turned. Hera was standing there, her suit torn, blood trickling down her arm. She looked tired. Not the flinty goddess of the desert, but a woman who had spent her entire existence living in the shadow of a lie. You knew, I whispered, clutching the blue book. You knew Silas killed your father. I knew someone did, Hera said, her voice hollow. I didn't know it was Silas. Until I met you. You have his eyes, Alara. The same restless, hungry gaze of a person who thinks they can outrun the dirt. I worked for Silas for 20 years, helping him bury his competitors, waiting for him to slip. But he was too good. He died before I could make him scream. And Kaylin? Kaylin found the blue book 3 years ago, Hera said, taking a step toward the pedestal. He didn't care about the murder. He cared about the leverage. He used the secrets in those jars to build Project Phoenix. He promised me that, once he liquidated the company and killed you, he'd give me Silas's confession, so I could finally clear my father's name. But Kaylin is a Vance. He was never going to give me anything. Is that why you helped me? I asked. To get to this room? I helped you because you were the only one who didn't know the house was built. On a grave, Hera said. But now you know. And now the thorns are coming down. Those stairs. Give me the book, Alara. Let me burn it all down. I looked at the blue leather. If I gave it to her, the Vance name would be erased. My grandfather's legacy would be revealed as a fraud and a murder. Kaylin would be free to say he was the true heir of a stolen empire. But if I kept it, the Thorns don't want the confession, Hera, I said, my mind working at lightning speed. They want the jars. They want the leverage. If we burn the Fade, Book, they still have the slips. They still have the city. Then we burn it all, Hera hissed. The stone door at the top of the stairs groaned. Cassian was through. I heard. His boots on the stone steps. The jars are made of glass, Hera, I said, grabbing a jar from the shelf. And? The slips are paper. But the room, look at the ceiling. I pointed my flashlight up. The ceiling wasn't stone. It was a series of heavy, lead pipes, the original fire suppression system for the homestead, filled with industrial-grade chemical foam. Silas hadn't just built a library, he'd built a self-destruct mechanism. The trigger isn't the key, I said, looking at the pedestal. It's the book. There was a weight sensor under the blue ledger. If the book was removed without the proper sequence, the room would be flooded with foam, sealing everything inside forever. He wanted us to choose, I said. The truth or the silence. I've spent 50 years waiting for the truth, Hera said, her hand reaching for the book. And I've spent my whole life defending a lie, I replied, my hand closing over hers. Let's give them the silence. We pulled the book together. A high-pitched whistle filled the vault. I saw Cassian appear at the bottom of the stairs, his face contorted with greed as he saw the jars. He raised his rifle, but he was too late. From the ceiling, a torrent of white, suffocating foam erupted, a tidal wave of chemical erasure. I grabbed Hera's hand and pulled her toward a small secondary vent Silas had shown me when I was a child, the laundry chute that led back to the main. With the house's basement, we scrambled inside just as the vault was swallowed. I heard Cassian's screams muffled by the thickening foam, the logistics of his greed, finally meeting a dead end. We collapsed on the floor of the mansion's basement, gasping for air, our clothes covered in white dust. The blue book was still in my hand. The gunfight outside had stopped. The police sirens were returning, louder this time. I looked at Hera. She was staring at the blue ledger, her chest heaving. It's over, I said. The jars are sealed, the thorns are trapped, and the secrets are buried in 3 feet of hardened foam. Hera reached out and touched the blue leather. And the murder? My father? I opened the book to the final page. There was a small photograph tucked into the binding. It was Silas, young and ragged, standing next to another man. They were both smiling. On the back it said, 1962, Silas and Orion. The dream was always shared. If you're reading this, the dream died, but the brotherhood didn't. Orion didn't die by my hand. He died to save mine. I took his name to keep his family safe from the people who were hunting us. Hera, I hope you can. Forgive a man for loving his friend more than his own reputation. Hera began to sob. It wasn't the jagged crying of a victim, but the slow, agonizing release of a lifetime of hate. Silas hadn't killed Orion. He had protected Hera by becoming the villain she needed him to be. I sat there in the dark basement, clutching the book that had nearly cost me my wote. Life. Kalen had tried to spike my juice because he thought he knew the secret. He thought he was the only wolf in the house. But the house was built by a man who knew that the only way to protect a secret is to become part of it. The police burst into the basement 10 minutes later. They found me and Hera, sitting among the shadows. Kalen was officially charged with the smuggling and the attempted murder. The Vance name remained, but the company was gone, liquidated and repurposed as a trust for the families harmed by the smuggling. Ring. I stayed on the property. I kept the pool house, but I never went back into the cellar. I didn't need to. The dirt was quiet now. But a month later, as I sat on the porch, a single glass of fresh apple juice in my hand, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an encrypted server. The foam won't last forever, Alara. And there were jar slips Kalen had already copied. The auditor's seat is still empty. Do you want the juice or do you want the book? I looked at the juice. It was sweet, crisp, and safe. I looked at the mansion, standing tall against the horizon. Then I stood up, walked to the fireplace, and threw the blue ledger into the flames. I watched the truth burn, and then I picked up the phone. This is Alara Vance, I said, my voice as cold and certain as the silver-haired woman's. I'm not the auditor. I'm the one who closes the accounts. Tell them. The dinner party is over. I hung up and took a sip of my juice. It tasted like a beginning. But as I looked out at the orchard, I saw a single, dark figure standing among Daig. The trees. It wasn't Kalen. It wasn't Cassian. It was someone new. And I realized that in the logistics of the Vance family, there is always one more delivery to be made. The figure in the orchard didn't move. It was a silhouette against the fading orange of the New Jersey sunset, a jagged shadow that seemed to feed on the floor's light. I set my glass down. The condensation leaves a ring on the antique wooden table, a mark of presence in a house that was trying to forget its own history. I didn't feel the paralyzing terror I'd felt a month ago. That version of Alara had been scrubbed away by the foam and the fire. This version was made of the basalt pedestal that had held the blue ledger. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the porch. "Hera's gone," I called out, my voice carrying over the rustle of the apple leaves. "The FBI is still processing the pool house. If you're looking for a jar, you're a month too late, and a soul too short." The figure stepped forward, the light hitting a face I hadn't seen in years, yet one that was instantly recognizable from the high society columns my mother used to obsess over. It was Sterling Vane, not the lawyer, but his father, Orion Vane, too, the son of the man my grandfather had replaced. "I'm not looking for a jar, Alara," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that sounded like the earth moving. "And I'm certainly not looking for Hera. She was always too emotional for this line of work. No, I'm here to offer my condolences. It's a tragedy what happened to the Vance name. To be reduced to a trust for the victims. Silas would have hated the weakness of it." "Silas is dead, Orion," I said, stepping off the porch. "And the weakness you see is just the house being cleaned." The rot was starting to smell. "Rot is just a perspective, my dear," Orion said, stopping 10 feet from me. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a stark contrast to the rough orchard dirt beneath his polished shoes. "Rot is what makes the soil fertile." Silas understood that. He took my father's name not out of brotherhood, as that sentimental book claimed, but because he was the better predator. My father was soft. Silas was steel. "And you have a bit of both, don't you?" "I'm not interested in your family history, Orion, or your predator theories. Why are you on my property?" "Because Kalen Vance was a fool, but he was a fool with a very important piece of my property. He had the Phoenix codes. The digital keys that don't exist in jars or ledgers. They exist in the mind of the person who built the software. They exist in you, Alara." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. Kalen hadn't just used me as a cover. He had built the entire smuggling infrastructure on the backbone of the Prostons times a lake, the Blang logistics software I'd spent 5 years perfecting. The glitches I'd been fixing, the route optimizations I'd been coding, they weren't for efficiency. They were the tunnels. "The company is dissolved, Orion. The software is being wiped by Federal placed in 5T contractors as we speak." Orion laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Federal contractors? They couldn't find a line of code if it was written in neon. You built that system with a ghost architecture, Alara, a mirror system that only activates under specific conditions. Conditions that I happen to know. But I need the developer's key to unlock the final gate. And if I say no, then the trust you so nobly set up will find itself empty by morning." "Orion," said, his smile sharpening, "the victims will get nothing. The charities will go bankrupt. And you, Alara, you will find that the poisoning case is reopened. My friends in the prosecutor's office have found some irregularities in the video Kalen provided. They think it might have been edited to hide your place's true involvement. It's amazing what a few $1,000,000 can do to a grainy security feed. The frame was still active. It was a hydra. Every time I cut off a head, 2 more grew from the blood. Kalen wasn't the architect. He was just a middle manager. The thorns were the muscle. But the veins were the owners. "You want me to move the Phoenix funds for you," I said, the realization settling in. "You want me to restart the routes." "I want you to be the auditor, Alara," Orion said, stepping closer. "The seat is empty. The city is in chaos because the Vance routes are cold. We need a professional, someone with the Vance name and the Vane blood." "Yes, Alara, did you really think Silas and my father were just friends? We're family, a messy, murderous family, and it's time you came home." I looked at the house. I looked at the juice glass on the table. I thought about the foam-filled vault and the charred remains of the blue ledger. I had tried to be the good Vance. I had tried to clear the debt with fairness. But Orion was, right, the dirt doesn't lie. And the dirt is made of bones. I need 24 hours, I said, my voice hardening. I need to access the Portianai mirror system and prepare the transfer. If I'm going to do this, I do it my way. No thorns, no Hera, just me and the code. 24 hours, Orion agreed. But don't try to run, Alara. The routes work both ways. We can find you anywhere a truck can go. He turned and walked back into the shadows. I went back inside the house. I didn't call the FBI. I didn't call Hera. I went to my office and opened my laptop. I pulled up the source code for the Vance logistics platform. I looked at the mirror system, the ghost I had built, without even realizing it. Kalen had been microdosing me with stress and gaslighting, but he'd also been feeding me problems to solve that were actually the components of the smuggling gate. I had built the most sophisticated black market delivery system in history, and I'd done it while thinking I was helping my husband save his company. I began to type. But I wasn't unlocking the gate for Orion. I was building a new kind of juice. If they wanted a Vance, I would give them a Vance. But I would be the kind of Vance that Silas was terrified of. The kind that doesn't just clear the debt, but cancels the entire account. I worked through the night, the blue light of the screen reflected in my eyes. I found the Phoenix Fund's $400 million in untraceable cryptocurrency and offshore assets. It was the lifeblood of Orion's world. I didn't move it to the trust. I moved it to a dead drop account. And then I wrote a small, elegant script that would trigger in precisely 24 hours. The next evening, Orion Vane II returned to the orchard. He was alone this time, confident in his leverage. I met him on the porch, my laptop open on the table. "Is it done?" he asked, greed glinting in his eyes. "The gate is open, Orion," I said, gesturing to the screen. "The funds are ready for transfer. But I have a question for you first. Why did Kylan really try to poison me? If I was the only one who could run the system, why risk killing me?" Orion laughed. "Because Kalen thought he'd learned enough to do it himself. He was arrogant. He thought the Vance's brilliance was something you could catch, like a cold. He realized too late that you were the only one who actually understood the ghost." "I see," I said, pressing a final key. "Well, Kalen was always a bit slow on the audit, just like you." Orion's phone paged. Then it paged again and again, a frantic series of alerts that made him fumble for the device in his silk pocket. What is this?" he stammered, his face turning the color of the bruised ski. "That's the Phoenix funds being distributed, Orion," I said, standing up. "But not to the trust, and not to you. Every dollar has been sent to the internal affairs departments of the police, the feds, and the regulatory boards of every city on the Vance route, along with a detailed log of every bribe you've ever paid, every shipment you've ever authorized, and the GPS coordinates of your private warehouses." You're dead," Orion hissed, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. "You've just declared war on everyone who matters." "No, Orion," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I've just liquidated the prated auditor. The routes are closed, the mirror is shattered, and the FBI, they've been listening to this entire conversation through the ghost microphone, ICLeveryou.org, installed in the logistics app Kalen made you download. From the shadows of the orchard, the red and blue lights erupted. Not 2 cars. This time, a fleet. Orion Vane II was tackled to the dirt, his expensive suit stained with the mud of the family legacy. I watched them lead him away, the last of the founding predators. Hera stepped out of the lead car. She looked at me, then at the laptop. "You didn't keep the money?" she asked. "The money was poisoned, Hera," I said. "Just like the juice. I don't want to be rich. I just want to be the one who finishes the audit." Hera nodded. "The feds are going to have a lot of questions about how you knew to distribute those funds." "I'll tell them what Silas told me," I said, picking up my juice glass. "The dirt doesn't lie. But the silence? The silence is for the ones who have nothing left to say." I took a long, cool sip of the juice. It was perfect. I sold the mansion a week later. I moved to a small town on the coast where nobody knew the name Vance and nobody cared about logistics. I started a small software company that focused on transparency and security. But sometimes, when I'm sitting on my new porch, watching the waves instead of the orchard, I'll get a package. No return address. Just a small glass jar with a single slip of paper inside. Account 402, closed. Account 119, settled. It seems Hera is still out there, clearing the debt one jar at a time. And every now and then, I'll find a small amber vial in the bottom of a drawer. A reminder of the night Kaylin Vance tried to erase me. I don't throw them away. I keep them as a testament to the fact that you can spike the juice, and you can burn the house. But a real Vance is the one who survives the dinner party. And as for Kaylin, I hear he's doing very well in prison. He's become the head of the logistics department for the laundry. He always did have a talent for moving things. I just hope he's careful with the juice. The waves crashed against the shore, a rhythmic, cleansing sound that made silence of the mansion feel like a lifetime ago. I closed my eyes and breathed. In the salt air, I was free. The audit was complete. But then, I heard the click of a heel on the wooden porch. I didn't open my eyes. Is it settled, Hera? There's one jar left, Alara, the voice said. But it wasn't Hera. I opened my eyes. Standing there in a simple white dress, her face fully healed and her eyes, clear of the jagged hate, was Lyra Thorne. You're dead, I whispered, my heart stopping. No, Lyra said, a small, sad smile on her lips. I was just the final delivery. Kaylin didn't poison me, Alara. I poisoned myself. I knew you'd swap the bay. Glasses. I needed the frame to be perfect so you'd go to Albuquerque. I needed you to find the blue ledger. Because Silas Vance wasn't my father. Then who? He was my grandfather, Lyra said, stepping to the railing. I'm your sister, Alara. And the Book of Endings? It wasn't a confession. It was a map. To us, I looked at her, and in the fading light, I saw the Vance eyes. Not the Vance eyes, restless, hungry ones, the ones that see through the dirt. The dinner party isn't over, sister, Lyra whispered. It's just becoming a family reunion. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that the logistics of a family are the only things that can never truly be audited. The revelation didn't just rattle me. It felt like the very coast I had fled to was dissolving into the salt white foam below. Lyra Thorne, my sister, the mistress, the consultant, the victim of my husband's jagged greed, was actually a piece of the same broken bloodline that had haunted my every waking hour. I looked at her, searching for a resemblance I had been too angry to see. There it was, the high, sharp cheekbones of Silas Vance, the way her hands gripped the railing, knuckles white and steady, just like my own. A family reunion, I echoed, the word tasting like iron. You nearly died. Lyra. I watched your heart stop at that table. I felt the heat of the poison. You claim was a ruse. How can you stand there and talk about family after the theater you put me through? Lyra stepped closer, the wind catching the hem of her white dress, making her look like a spectral figure against the darkening sea. I didn't nearly die, Alara. I practiced. I spent months microdosing the sedative Kaylin was microdosing you with. I knew exactly how much my body could take. I knew the response time of the local paramedics. I knew the exact moment you'd swap those glasses because I was the one who taught Kaylin to be predictable. I had to. Become the victim so you would become the hunter. I had to force you to find the blue ledger. Why? I hissed, the basalt in my chest hardening. If you wanted the ledger, why didn't you just take it yourself? You had the codes. You had the access. Because the ledger was a trap for anyone but you, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Silas knew the veins would come for it. He knew that if the illegitimate branch, my branch, touched it first, the house would burn. He designed the vault to recognize the legitimate hand. You were the only one who I could unlock the truth without the foam swallowing the proof. I needed you to see who our grandfather really was. I needed you to understand that the Vanes and the Vances aren't two separate families. We are the same mistake. I looked out at the ocean, the rhythmic crashing of the waves feeling like the heartbeat of a world I didn't recognize. Silas Vance, the man of iron and salt, had fathered a shadow dynasty and then spent the rest of his life playing us against one another like pieces on a logistics board. He hadn't just built a company, he'd built a coliseum. So what's the map? I asked. If the Blue Ledger was just a confession, what is the Book of Endings really for? Lyra reached into the small silk bag she was carrying and pulled out a single, translucent vial. It wasn't amber. It was clear as the water at the base of the Upsisley cliffs. The logistics of the Vance Empire wasn't about trucks, Alara. It was about the blank 20 lan. Antidote. The Phoenix funds aren't just money. They are the collateral for a biological monopoly. In the 60s, Silas and Orion didn't just move tech. They moved the source of a rare, synthetic neurostabilizer, something the world's elite pay millions for to counteract the very poisons the veins distribute. Kalen wanted the smuggling routes because he wanted to control the supply. But the map isn't in a book. It's in our DNA. I felt a surge of nausea. What are you talking about? Silas didn't just protect Orion's family. He experimented on us. The vitamins he gave you as a child? The tonics my mother was forced to take? We are the living archives, Alara. Our blood contains the markers for the stabilizer. We aren't just heirs. We are the product. And the veins know it. Orion II wasn't like looking for codes. He was looking for the source. He was looking for us. I backed away from her, the coastal air suddenly feeling thick and suffocating. The sensitive heart my father had always mocked, the fatigue that plagued me, the way I could see patterns and logistics that others missed. It wasn't just brilliance. It was a design. I was a Vance logistics truck, and the cargo was in my veins. That's why Hera was watching, I whispered. She wasn't looking for a debt. She was monitoring the shipment. Exactly, Lyra said. Hera works for the highest bidder. And right now, the highest bidder is a shadow corporation that makes Orion Vane look like a street-level dealer. They let Kalen play his games because it kept the cargo safe and localized. But now that you've dismantled the company, you've become a unregulated asset. And assets are either liquidated or reclaimed. The figure in the orchard, the message from the encrypted server, the new encrypted auditor. It wasn't a game of corporate fraud anymore. It was a hunt for a genetic blueprint. What do we do? I asked, looking at the woman who was my sister and my betrayer. We do what Silas should have done 60 years ago, Lyra said, her eyes flashing with a jagged, Vance-like certainty. Chungta swabal bando. We find the source, the original laboratory Silas hid in the Albuquerque desert, and we stakely planned. Destroy the Foundation once and for all. If there is no antidote, there is no value. And if there is no value, they will leave us alone. Albuquerque, I sighed. Always Albuquerque. But this time, Lyra said, extending her hand. We don't go as hunter and sheep. We go as the storm. I looked at her hand. I thought about the juice at the dinner table. I thought about the 7 years of silence with Kalen. I realized then that my survival hadn't been an accident. I was the strongest iteration of Silas's dream. And if the dream had become a nightmare, it was my job to wake up the world. I didn't take her hand. I walked past her into the house and grabbed the paring knife Hera had left on the table. I walked to the fireplace and pulled a loose stone from the hearth, a secondary hiding spot Silas had told me about. Inside was a heavy, old-fashioned revolver and a final handwritten note from Silas. Alara, the blood is the ink, the debt is the paper, don't let them read the plies. Final chapter. I looked at Lyra. I have the car. But if you're lying to me again, sister, I won't need a spiked glass to finish the audit. I'll do it with the steel Silas gave me. Lyra smiled, a thin, sharp line. I'd expect nothing less from a Vance. We drove into the night, the coastal road disappearing behind us as we headed back toward the desert. The silence in the car was different now. It wasn't the vacuum of a lie. It was the pressurized cabin of a suicide mission. As we crossed the border into New Mexico, the stars looked like cold, unblinking eyes. I thought about the logistics of my life. I had built software to move the world, but I had never learned how to move myself. I had been a cog in a machine I didn't understand. But as the Albuquerque garage appeared on the horizon, glowing like a skeletal ghost in the moonlight, I realized that I wasn't a cog. I was the engine. We arrived at the site. This time, there was no Cassian Thorne, no Hera, just the wind and the smell of ancient dust. Lyra led me past the basement stairs, toward a section of the garage that was buried under 30 feet of sand and, Austin may tell. There's a secondary elevator, she said, her voice strained by the exertion of moving a heavy iron plate. Silas called it the needle. It leads to the processing plant. We descended. The laboratory was a subterranean cathedral of glass and stainless steel, preserved by the dry desert air. It looked like a temple of science, but the smell, the cloying, sweet scent of the stabilizer made my skin crawl. In the center of the room was a large glass tank. Inside, suspended in a translucent blue liquid, was a network of moss-like organisms. It was the source. The Vance brilliance. Silas found this in the Amazon in the 50s, Lyra whispered. He brought it back and spent 40 years trying to bond it to human DNA. He succeeded with us. But the organism is unstable. It requires a specific environmental trigger to remain dormant. If that trigger is removed, the stabilizer becomes a lethal, rapid-onset toxin. The juice, I whispered. The juice was the trigger, Lyra said, her eyes filling with tears. We have to drink it every day to stay alive, Alara. Silas didn't give us vitamins. He gave us a tether. He made sure we could never leave the house. He made sure we would always be his logistics. I looked at the tank. I looked at the paring knife in my hand. I realized then the true scale of my grandfather's love. He hadn't protected us. He had owned us. He had made our very existence a delivery route that he controlled. Kaylin knew, I said, a jagged sob escaping my throat. He wasn't spiking the juice to kill me. He was withholding the trigger. He was letting the toxin activate. He was watching me die of my own blood. And the antidote? There is no antidote, Lyra said. The blood is the antidote for everyone else. But for us, it's the noose. I walked to the tank. I saw my reflection in the glass. I looked at the moss, the beautiful blue parasitic thing that was the reason for all the murder, all the fraud and all the brilliance. Then we end the route, I said. I raised the iron fire poker I'd brought from the mansion and slammed it against the glass. The tank shattered. The blue liquid erupted like a tidal wave of ice, swallowing the laboratory. The cloying scent became a deafening roar in my nose. I heard Lyra scream as the laboratory's alarm began to wail, a high-pitched siren that signaled the self-destruct of the Vance Foundation. We scrambled for the elevator, the blue moss clinging to our clothes like a cold, living ink. As we reached the surface, the Albuquerque garage began to collapse, the sand swallowing the laboratory and the secret of the antidote, forever. We sat in the dirt, gasping for air, the blue glow fading from our skin as it met the harsh desert sun. The tether was broken. The logistics was over. But as I looked at Lyra, I saw a new kind of terror in her eyes. Alara, she whispered, if the trigger is gone, how long do we have? I looked at my hands. I felt the flutter in my heart the one Kaylin had. Laughed at. It wasn't fatigue. It was the toxin. I don't know, sister, I said, looking out at the vast, empty desert. But for the first time in 32 years, I'm not waiting for a delivery. I'm just living. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last vial of juice Kaylin had left. In the mansion, I looked at the clear liquid, the trigger. My lifeline. I poured it into the sand. The audit is closed, Lyra, I said. Tell Silas we cleared the account. We sat there together, two sisters born of a ghost, watching the sun rise over the desert. The Vance name was gone. The company was gone. The brilliance was fading. But as the first rays of light hit the collapsed garage, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't the auditor. I wasn't the CEO. I was just Alara. And for a woman who had spent her life in the logistics of the dead, that was enough. The desert was silent, a vast golden shroud that had finally claimed the Vancely claimed the Vancely. Legacy. We didn't move for a long time, the weight of our new finite lives settling over us like a layer of dust. Lyra's breathing was shallow, a rhythmic echo of my own, both of us waiting for the end of the clock Silas had set in our veins. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and the sun climbed higher into the sky, the expected collapse didn't happen. The toxin didn't stop my heart. The flutter didn't become a storm. I looked at my hands. The blue ink of the moss had dried into a fine, gray, likely Nezadotter's powder that blew away in the desert wind. I felt a surge of energy, not the played, jagged, synthetic brilliance of the stabilizer, but a raw, human clarity. Lyra, I whispered. Look. She opened her eyes. her face pale but her gaze sharp. She looked at her own hands, then at Mina. I don't feel sick, she said, her voice trembling. The juice, we should be dead by now. I looked at the shattered remains of the elevator shaft, the sand pouring into the void like an hourglass that had finally run out. Silas lied, I said, a sudden wild laughter bubbling up in my chest. He lied. About the tether. He didn't make us dependent on the juice. He made us believe we were. The juice wasn't a trigger, Lyra. It was the stabilizer. It was the very thing that was keeping the Vance brilliance suppressed. He wasn't giving Debly, us life. He was keeping us dull. The realization was a thunderclap. Silas Vance hadn't been protecting us from our own blood. He had been protecting his empire from us. He knew that if the Vance women ever realized their full potential, the raw, uninhibited genius of the Amazonian organism, we would have dismantled him decades ago. The juice was the muzzle. Kalen hadn't been withholding the trigger. He'd been withholding the suppression. He'd unintentionally unleashed the very thing Silas was terrified of. And the toxin? It was just the feeling of a mind finally waking up. We aren't dying, Lyra, I said, standing up and feeling the world come into a blank, focus so sharp it was almost painful. We're finally seeing. Lyra stood up beside me, her movements fluid and powerful. She looked at the horizon, and I knew she could see the heat waves, the air currents, the very logistics of the desert floor. We were the Vance logistics. Not the trucks, not the cargo, but the system itself. The auditor, Lyra whispered. He wasn't a man. It was a role Silas knew only one of us could fill if we were ever activated. Then let's go fill it, I said. We didn't head back to the coast. We headed back to the city. But this time we didn't go to the mansion or the glass tower. We went to the shadows. We went to the small, nameless warehouses and the forgotten delivery routes. Within a month, the Vance name had become a myth. But a new system began to emerge, a silent, untraceable web of logistics that didn't move black market tech or antidotes. It moved the truth. It moved the evidence of corporate greed, the secrets of the veins, and the transparency that Silas had spent 60 years burying. Hera found us 3 months later, in a small office above a bakery in the garment district. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have a flinty gaze. She looked at us with a kind of fearful respect. The veins are in ruins, Hera said, sitting across from us. Orion II is cooperating with the feds, and Sterling has fled the country. The trust is flourishing. But the city is quiet. Too quiet. People are calling you the Sisters of the Shadow. We're just clearing the accounts, Hera, I said, leaning over a digital map that showed every logistics route in the country. The debt is finally being paid. And the organism? Hera asked. In your blood? I looked at Lyra, who was coding an encryption gate that would take the FBI a century to crack. It's not a cargo anymore, Hera, I said. It's the pilot. Silas wanted a legacy. We gave him a reckoning. Hera stood up to leave, but she paused at the door. One more thing, Alara. Kalen Vance. He's not in the laundry department anymore. He had an incident in the yard last week. Someone spiked his juice. He survived, but he'll never speak again. The doctors say his mind is vacant. I looked at my glass of water. Clear, simple, and safe. That's unfortunate, I said. Audit completed. Hera left, and the silence of the bakery office returned. Lyra looked up from her screen, her eyes glowing with that beautiful, dangerous Vance blue. What's next, sister? She asked. I looked at the map. I looked at the world, a vast, chaotic machine of logistics and secrets. Next, I said, a thin, sharp smile appearing on my lips. Next, we host a dinner party. And this time, everyone gets a seat. The story of Alara and Lyra Vance didn't end with a collapse or a conviction. It ended with a transformation. They didn't just survive the spiked juice. They became the antidote. And as the city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the millions of lives being moved by the Silent Sisters, I realized that some foundations are built on rot, but the ones built on the storm, those are the ones that truly last. The dinner party was over. The audit was closed. And the Vance family? They were finally truly in charge. I sat back and watched the sunrise. The juice tasted like victory. But the blood? The blood felt like destiny.